Have you wanted to play a reanimated deck that abuses the graveyard whilst also being resilient to removal? Do you love the idea of having multiple copies of the same legendary creature? Do you want to play a commander that offers many unique, interesting, and powerful lines of play? Then I think it's time we show our opponents that true legends never die with Ratadrabik of Urborg. Let's begin by looking at our commander and seeing what his abilities offer. Ratadrabik is a 4-mana 3/3 zombie wizard that has Vigilance and Ward 2 and says, other zombies you control have Vigilance, and whenever another legendary creature you control dies, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's not legendary and it's a 2/2 black zombie in addition to its other colours and types. So from this, there's a few key things we want to achieve to be able to make the most of these abilities. To start, we'll want to play legendary creatures that have ETB or leave the battlefield triggers, as well as powerful static effects. That way, when they die and leave a token copy of themselves, we'll get value from them immediately. We'll also want ways to bring back our legendaries when they die, so we can have multiple copies of them on board. This includes not only cards that reanimate them from our graveyard, but also ones that return them to the battlefield immediately. Finally, we'll want to supplement this with cards that care about legendary creatures as well as creatures dying, so that we can make the most of this strategy. If we can do these things, then we should be able to present our opponents with a powerful clone army that's hard to slow even against board wipe heavy decks. So now that we know what the overall direction of the deck looks like, let's look at the cards that are going to keep our hand full and keep the legendaries hitting the board. Our first card is Benny Brack's Zoologist, a 4-mana creature with Convoke that draws us a card at each end step if we created a token that turn. While the card draw Benny offers us is conditional in that we typically need our commander out to get his effect, the fact we can trigger it each turn and we can Convoke him, making his casting cost much cheaper than what it appears, makes it worth including. Black Market Connections is a 3-mana enchantment that can make a treasure token, draw a card, and create a 3/2 shapeshifter token with Changeling at the cost of 1, 2, and 3 life respectively, depending on which modes we choose on our upkeep. Because our deck has to spread its slots between sack outlets and reanimation, in addition to card advantage, mana acceleration, and interaction, cards like Black Market that fill the role of multiple slots really help the deck function effectively. In addition, the creature token being a Changeling means Ratadrabik will give them Vigilance, a nice little side benefit. Braids Are Is a Nightmare is a 3-mana creature that says, at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a permanent that shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. If we play this early, we can almost guarantee drawing at least 2 cards, but sometimes 3 if our opponents don't want to sack a mana dork. But in the mid to late game, if they don't want us to get the card draw, they have to sack the permanent type we choose, and if it's a creature, we can just sack Braids herself and get a copy back to do it all again next turn. For 3-mana, Braids provides a lot of value and with the right setup can give us a lot of card advantage. Dark Prophecy is a 3-mana enchantment that draws us a card at the loss of 1 life every time one of our creatures dies. Because we plan for our creatures to die often, this should draw us a lot of cards, and the fact it doesn't care whether the creature is a token or not works even better with our commander's ability. Erebos Bleakhearted is a 4-mana enchantment creature with Indestructible that lets us draw a card at the cost of 2 life whenever a creature dies on our board. In addition, we can also pay 2 mana to sack a creature to give a creature -2, -1 until end of turn. Like Dark Prophecy, we can draw cards when any creature dies, including tokens, an effect we are always happy to have, but this also protects itself very well by being indestructible, making it harder for your opponents to remove. Because of this, it also makes a great attacker and blocker. Esper Sentinel is a 1-mana creature that can draw us cards whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn if they don't pay X, where X is its power. Being cheap to cast, and more importantly in a reanimated deck attached to a body, means that we can either sacrifice it for value or easily get it back if it gets removed. Gonti, Lord of Luxury, is a 4-mana creature with Death Touch that when it ETBs, lets us look at the top 4 cards of an opponent's library, exile one of them, and then have the ability to cast that card using mana of any colour. While paying 4 mana to essentially draw 1 card isn't a great rate, Gonti does give good digging power to find a useful card. In addition, he does provide us access to cards and effects we normally wouldn't have in our colours, meaning this can turn the game on its head in a number of ways. For example, if we use Gonti to target a blue player and steal a counterspell, now we can hold up interaction our opponents will likely never see coming. Midnight Reaper is a 3-mana creature that draws us a card at the loss of 1 life every time a non-token creature of ours dies. Excellent card advantage when we begin sacking our legends. It also serves as a great way to rebuild our board if an opponent wipes it, replacing some of the creatures wiped with new cards in hand. Mangara the Diplomat is a 4-mana creature with lifelink that draws us a card every time an opponent attacks us with 2 or more creatures that turn, or cast their second spell for a turn. Mangara rewards us against both aggressive decks and decks that are accelerating ahead casting multiple spells a turn, So they have the option of continuing ahead and feeding us cards, or slowing down to stop us from drawing, which just buys us more time to catch up or get ahead of them. Either way, we end up happy, but even more so when we have multiple Mangaras on board. Plumb the Forbidden is a 2-mana instant that says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may sacrifice one or more creatures. When you do, copy this spell for each creature sacrificed this way. You draw a card and you lose 1 life. So in our deck, this acts as cheap card draw that is hard to interact with, scales well as the game goes longer, and importantly, gives us a way to sack our legendaries if we don't have a sack outlet online. One of the best feelings is having a full board and casting this in response to a board wipe, knowing that even the blue player at the table can't stop you refilling your hand. Skullclamp is a 1-mana artifact that draws us 2 cards when the creature we equip at 2 dies. In an Aristocrats deck, this card always pulls its weight, and our deck is no different. The fact it's a permanent and an artifact also has additional synergies with cards we will discuss later. Timna the Weaver is a 3-mana creature with lifelink that draws us a card at the cost of 1 life for each opponent we dealt combat damage to that turn. Because we are a heavy creature deck, Timna makes a great play in the early game to use some of our creatures to draw cards with, especially when there will reliably be at least one opponent who can't block effectively. In the mid to late game, her effectiveness will vary, but between having flyers, death touches, and the ability to make a go-wide token army, it shouldn't be difficult to draw at least 1 card per turn with Timna. Our last card to discuss is Yawgmoth, Thran Physician, a 4-mana creature that lets us sack creatures to draw a card and give a creature a -1/-1 counter. We can also pay 2 mana and discard a card to proliferate. Yawgmoth pretty much does everything we could want him to. He provides a free sack outlet, draws us cards, and provides a limited form of interaction, all at a great cost. Although having multiple copies of him won't benefit us much, just having him stick on board should ensure our game plan goes ahead without interruption. And that's all of our card advantage cards. Now let's take a look at the cards that are going to give us all the mana to cast the cards we're drawing. Arcane Signet is a 2-mana rock that is great to cast on turn 2 and helps fix our colours at no additional cost. Goldmere, Leadenmere, Mere Convert, and Ornithopter of Paradise are all 2-mana creatures that produce coloured mana, but also bodies with which we can profitably use with cards like Erebos and Plumb the Forbidden. Deep Known Terramancer is a 2-mana creature with flash that puts any planes into play tapped if an opponent had a land ETB without being played. Although not always guaranteed to ramp if played on turn 2, the fact this is a static effect that can get more than 1 land into play makes this one of our best options for ramping. Illuminor Ceres is a 3-mana creature that we can tap and sacrifice another creature to add black mana based on that creature's mana value. Although this doesn't tap for mana on its own, it can allow us to have some explosive turns by accelerating into one of our bomb legends or giving us the ability to cast multiple spells in a turn. It also demonstrates why we prefer to have creatures in our card slots where viable, to take full advantage of creatures like Ceres. Soldavi Adnate is a 2-mana creature that we can tap and sacrifice a black or artifact creature to add black mana based on that creature's mana value. So similar to Ceres, it produces mana from sacking creatures, but there are a few notable differences. The first is that Soldevi cannot sacrifice our white creatures, which is certainly a downside. But unlike Ceres, it can sacrifice itself to its ability, which means when we need the extra mana in a pinch, or want to trigger something like Midnight Reaper for card draw, we can do so. Regardless, like Ceres, Soldevi is a great mana accelerant and sacrifice outlet the deck is happy to have. Scholar of New Horizons is a 2-mana creature that ETBs with a +1/+1 counter and says, tap and remove a counter from a permanent you control, search your library for a plains card and reveal it. If an opponent controls more lands than you, you may put that card onto the battlefield tapped. If you don't put the card onto the battlefield, put it into your hand, then shuffle. In most cases, this will get us the 1 land we desire to ramp, and then we have a body left over to use for our other sacrifice effects. But there are a few cards in our deck like Yawgmoth that do give us access to counters, so the potential to find more lands and put them into play is there, albeit a much smaller chance. One thing to note about Scholar, however, is that it says plains, not a basic plains, meaning we can color fix by finding dual lands like Godless Shrine. Relic of Legends is a 3-mana artifact that taps for 1 mana of any color and also allows us to tap our legendaries for 1 mana of any color also. This can be a very strong mana accelerant in this deck, not only fixing our colors, but also allowing our legends to tap for mana too, even if they have summoning sickness. Our last mana accelerant is the Golden Throne, a 4-mana artifact that has 2 abilities. The first stops us from losing the game, sets our life total to 1, and then exiles itself. The second taps and sacks a creature to add 3 mana in any combination of colors. As mentioned earlier, cards that pull double duty are very welcome in decks such as these that have to spread their card slots in a number of directions. The Golden Throne being a mana accelerant and a sack outlet allows us to free up room for cards for other areas. It's also notable the ability to make coloured mana in any amount helps cast our pip-intensive cards, as well as enabling multiple spells to be cast per turn. And that covers all our mana accelerants. Now let's look at the cards that are going to help us interact with our opponents and keep them at bay long enough so we can get ahead. Douthie Voidwalker is a 2-mana creature with Shadow that says, if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, instead exile it with a void counter on it. Also, you can sack it to play an exiled card with a void counter on it without paying its mana cost. For 2 mana, this is a very powerful ability, giving us access to a wide range of spells we normally wouldn't have access to, in addition to being a great hate piece against opposing graveyard decks or aristocrat strategies. But because we also run a lot of recursion, this means we are more likely to be able to reuse Douthy's ability again and again, making this even more powerful in our deck. Grave Pact is a 4 mana enchantment that makes each other opponent sack a creature whenever one of our creatures dies. One of the best cards you can run in an aristocrat strategy. If this lands, this can seriously hamper most other decks and continue to do so until it's removed. Lauren of the Third Path is a 3 mana creature with vigilance that can destroy an artifact or enchantment when it ETBs. Also, we can tap her so that an opponent and us can both draw a card. Simple, cost-effective removal that can also act as card advantage when we need it. It will be rare that we won't be happy to have Lauren in hand or on the battlefield to get another trigger with Ratadrabik. Sheoldred the Apocalypse is a 4 mana creature with Death Touch that says, whenever you draw a card you gain 2 life, and whenever an opponent draws a card they lose 2 life. A simple but very powerful ability for 4 mana, this can act as a hate piece against card draw which many decks rely on to accelerate ahead of their opponents. But in our deck, if we can even get 2 to 3 on board, this can quickly become a win con in and of itself. Kambal, Console of Allocation, is a 3 mana creature that gains us 2 life and causes our opponents to lose 2 life every time they cast a non-creature spell. Very effective against Spellslinger or non-creature decks, having 2 to 3 Kambals on board will quickly put a clock on those deck archetypes and can really slow their game plans down. The life gain will also be useful for us when we pay life for some of our more powerful effects. Skrolv, Defector Might, is a 1 mana creature with Toxic 1 that can't block. It also has the ability that if we pay 1 Phyrexian White and tap it, we choose a colour and the creature we target gets Toxic 1 as well as Hexproof from that colour until end of turn. It also can't be blocked by creatures of that colour. For 1 mana, Skrolv does a lot. It can protect our commander or other key legendaries so we can ensure we get their abilities. It can allow a creature to get in combat damage, which is relevant for cards like Tymna, and it makes your opponents hesitant to even use removal on your creatures because the ability to effectively counter it is right there in front of them. Rankle, Master of Pranks, is a 4 mana creature with flying and haste that says, whenever Rankle deals combat damage to a player, choose any number. Each player discards a card, each player loses 1 life and draws a card, and each player sacrifices a creature. In our deck, Rankle serves multiple roles. Firstly, he is a Plaguecrafter that can get this effect turn after turn if we have the bodies to spare, remembering with our commander out, it can sack itself and create a token copy to do the same next turn. Secondly, he starts stripping our opponent's hands of cards, and while we have to discard also, remember that with our Reanimation cards, we will have the best chance of breaking parity with this, especially if we discard a high mana value creature. And lastly, it can draw us some cards if the downside of also giving our opponent's cards is worth it, for example, if we have Sheoldred the Apocalypse out. These abilities combined give Rankle a lot of utility in how it interacts with our opponents, especially when we have multiple copies on board. Kokusho the Evening Star is a 6 mana creature with flying that says, when Kokusho dies, each opponent loses 5 life. You gain life equal to the life lost this way. Any black dominant deck like ours will typically run effects that require paying life, sometimes a substantial amount of it. Kokusho goes a long way towards quickly refilling that life so we can continue to pay for those effects, as well as keep our life total safe from aggressive decks. But once we start sacking multiple Kokushos, this quickly becomes a win con as our opponent's life totals start to fall fast. Yosei the Morning Star is a 6 mana creature with flying that says, when Yosei dies, target player skips their next untapped step. Tap up to 5 target permanents that player controls. Being able to target any permanent means we will largely be able to limit an opponent's mana production as well as any creatures that require tapping or turning sideways for combat. With our commander making token copies of this, combined with our recursion package, this can quickly lock our opponents down and prevent them from doing much while we accelerate our game plan. Sheoldred Whispering One is a 7 mana creature with Swamp Walk that reanimates a creature of ours on our upkeep and forces our opponents to sack a creature on theirs. This card is perfect for our strategy and overall game plan, as it allows us to keep bringing back the powerful legendaries we will be sacking for even more value, while also keeping our opponents and their creatures in check. One thing to note is that with just Rata, Sheoldred and a sack outlet online, we can get a powerful engine going. Before our turn, we sack Sheoldred, make a token copy, then when it moves to our upkeep, the token Sheoldred reanimates the original. Each turn cycle, our opponents sack more and more creatures and we reanimate more and more of our own. This becomes an engine our opponents will have much difficulty stopping once it's online. Last up is Elesh Norn, Grand Cenobite, a 7 mana creature that has Vigilance and gives other creatures we control +2/+2 and creatures our opponents control -2/-2 as a static ability. For a surprising number of decks, this negative ability can hurt them quite a bit. This severely hampers token and go wide decks, and even just heavy creature decks will suffer in some way. But in our deck, if we can even have 2 Elesh Norns out at once, almost all decks will struggle to function and will likely be shut down until they are removed. Combine that with the Anthem effect to buff up our creatures, and it shouldn't take long for us to close out the game. And that covers our interactive cards. Now let's look at the cards that are going to help recur our creatures for value, and most importantly, allow us to have multiple copies of the same legend on board. Animate Dead. Dance of the Dead and Necromancy are 2 to 3 mana enchantments that can reanimate a creature from any player's graveyard. For the cost, this is a very powerful effect and helps us to quickly get multiple copies of the same legendary creature, while also offering versatility in reanimating a bomb creature from our opponents. Just keep in mind that for Necromancy, you can cast it at flash speed if you're willing to sacrifice the reanimated creature on that turn's cleanup step. Bringing a creature back from anyone's graveyard at instant speed may enable some sneaky lines your opponents weren't anticipating. Reanimate is a 1-mana sorcery that achieves the same effect, except at the loss of life equal to the creature's mana value. While this is a downside to take into consideration, we have multiple ways to regain life in this deck, some we've already discussed. Regardless, being only 1 mana still makes this mana for mana one of the best reanimation spells available. Victimize is a 3-mana sorcery that lets us reanimate 2 creatures from our graveyard at the cost of sacrificing a creature. As you probably realise by now, sacrificing our creatures is something we actively want to do, so this downside is no downside at all. But being able to reanimate not 1 but 2 creatures is very powerful, and depending on what we sack and reanimate, this could be game changing if it resolves. Junji the Midnight Sky is a 5-mana creature with flying and menace that says, when it dies, choose 1. Each opponent discards 2 cards and loses 2 life, or put target non-dragon creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control, you lose 2 life. So at 5 mana with our commander out, this can reanimate 2 creatures from any graveyard, which is actually quite good for the cost. But we can also use this as an interactive piece, making our opponents discard up to 4 cards, which should be a big hit for them, especially in the mid-game. Having this utility attached to a good evasive attacker and blocker makes this an easy include for the deck. Loyal Retainers is a 3-mana creature that says, sacrifice Loyal Retainers, return target legendary creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only during your turn before attackers are declared. For 3 mana, this is quite a powerful recursive piece. Being able to activate it straight away is very important for getting multiple copies of a legendary on board, and being attached to a body means we can get multiple uses out of it with our other recursion pieces. Priest of Fell Rites is a 2-mana creature that we can tap and pay 3 life to return a creature from our graveyard to the battlefield. We can also pay 5 mana to unearth it and do the same. Cheap to get down, attached to a body for recursion, and being able to be used again for 5 mana are all reasons why this card finds a place in the deck. Whisper Blood Litigist is a 4-mana creature that we can tap and sacrifice 2 creatures to reanimate a creature from our graveyard. Note that this doesn't say other creatures, so with our commander out, we can sack Whisper and another creature to reanimate a creature, while also getting a copy of Whisper itself to do it all again next turn. In the mid to late game, this serves as a strong recursion piece that should keep us in the game, especially against decks with a lot of creature interaction. Luminous Broodmoth is a 4-mana creature that returns a creature of ours that died to the battlefield with a flying counter on it if it didn't have flying to begin with. Most of the creatures we run, legendary or otherwise, don't have flying, so this will act to return a good number of them to the battlefield, one of the most important actually being Ratadrabik. Our last card to discuss is Gift of Immortality, a 3-mana enchantment that we can attach to a creature, and when it dies, this enchantment returns that creature to the battlefield and reattaches to it on the end step. Because this can happen each turn, with our commander out and a sack outlet, we can make 4 copies of whatever legendary it is attached to each turn cycle, which is incredible for the cost. Just imagine the value we could generate attaching this to creatures like Junji, reanimating 4 creatures a turn or making opponents discard 8 cards, while attached to Sheoldred the Whispering One, our opponents would have to sacrifice up to 4 creatures a turn while we could reanimate 4 on our upkeep. And that covers all of our recursion cards. Now let's move on to our utility cards, cards that either enhance or support what our deck is trying to do. Carrion Feeder and Viscera Seer are both 1-mana creatures that we can use as free sack outlets, important to get our deck's engines rolling. Viscera Seer's Scry ability can also be useful to filter to the draws we want, while Carrion Feeder is a zombie, meaning as it gets big, we can attack with Vigilance while Rata is on board. Altar of Dementia is a 2-mana artifact that also acts as a free sack outlet, except we mill cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. This mill ability is actually quite useful for our deck, as it increases the targets our recursion spells can hit. Yahenni Undying Partisan is a 3-mana creature with haste that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, and also acts as a sack outlet that protects itself by giving it indestructible until end of turn. Being a free sack outlet that protects itself and comes attached to a legendary body for further resilience makes this an easy include, though the growing body that can become a big swinger and blocker is also a welcome addition. Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar are both 3-mana artifacts that serve dual roles as both a sack outlet and a mana producer, Ashnod's making 2 colourless and Phyrexian 1 mana of any colour for each creature sacrificed. Having a sack outlet available is key for this deck to achieve its main game plan, but the fact it also refunds us mana means we can get into some powerful loops, sacking and casting creatures from the mana we get. These cards are very powerful sack outlets and mana accelerants in this deck, and you will almost always be happy to see them. Jadar, Ghoulcaller of Nephalia, is a 2-mana creature that creates a 2/2 Decayed zombie on each of our end steps, provided we control no creatures with Decayed at the time. A small token maker seems like nothing to get excited about, but this card works with a surprising number of cards in our deck, which only gets better if we have Jadar in our opening hand. For example, with Skullclamp, we get to attach it to the Decayed zombie and draw 2 cards each turn, even without a sack outlet on board, because the Decayed zombie sacks itself at end of combat. It draws 1 card each turn with Benny Brax because a token is being made, and it can also draw a card with Timner out provided it connects to combat. Don't underestimate just what this card can do in this deck. Sun Titan is a 6-mana creature that returns a permanent with mana value 3 or less when it ETBs or attacks. Although a non-legend, this ability to essentially reanimate permanents is very powerful, especially because it can return non-creature permanents like Gift of Immortality or Dark Prophecy. But we can often use this on legends like Braids for card draw, Lauren for interaction, and Illuminor Ceres for mana acceleration. This may get replaced one day with a legend, but that legend will have to do a lot of work to take Sun Titan's place. Elasil Kor, Sadistic Pilgrim, is a 2-mana creature with Death Touch that gains us 1 life every time another creature enters our battlefield, and drains each opponent 1 life every time another creature we control dies. This gain and drain may be small to start with, but when we start getting multiple copies of it on board, that life will really start to add up, especially when we get into our sack and recursive loops. In addition, Ellis is cheap to get down and also makes a great blocker with its Death Touch ability. Elenda the Dusk Rose is a 4-mana creature that has lifelink and says, whenever another creature dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Elenda. Also, when Elenda dies, create X 1/1 white vampire creature tokens with lifelink, where X is Elenda's power. In Aristocrats decks, Elenda always pulls a weight, getting larger with every creature that dies, and when she dies herself, she leaves behind a large army for attacking, blocking, or to be used for further Aristocrat effects. In our deck, she goes further because with our commander out, when she first dies, we get the army of tokens and another Elenda to grow even bigger as we use those tokens for various effects. She won't necessarily be game ending on her own, but she will go far in helping us to close out the game instead. Phyrexian Reclamation is a 1-mana enchantment that lets us pay 2 mana and 2 life as many times as we'd like to return a creature from our graveyard to our hand. You've seen almost all the creatures that this deck runs, and many of them, especially the low mana value ones, are ones we'd like to get back to our hand to cast again. Reclamation is a very cost-effective way of doing this, and will really prove its worth in the late game when our graveyard is full and all players are running low on cards and interaction. Soaring Half is a 3-mana instant that destroys a creature and makes 2 token copies of it. With our commander out, whatever other legendary creature we target this with will give us 3 token copies of it, 2 from Soaring Half and 1 from our commander. On its own, that's already a very powerful effect, but we can even target Ratadrabik himself and make 2 token copies of him, increasing the number of tokens we get when sacking legendaries later. The raw power that this card provides with our commander should set us up in a strong position if it resolves. Teysa Karlov is a 4-mana creature that says, if a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Also, creature tokens you control are Vigilance and Lifelink. So with our commander, Teysa gives us 2 tokens for every legendary that dies. That on its own would make it worth including, but there's more. If Teysa herself dies, Ratadrabik makes 2 token copies of her, which means the next time a legend dies, we get 3 token copies of it. If that wasn't enough, she also gives all our tokens Vigilance and Lifelink, so now all the tokens Ratadrabik makes become even more useful. In this deck, Teysa will quickly spiral out of control, and it's something your opponents can't let stay around for long. Mondrak, Glory Dominus, is a 4-mana creature that doubles any tokens we make anytime we would create them. In addition, for 2 Phyrexian White, a colorless mana, and the sacrifice of 2 artifacts or creatures, we can give Mondrak an indestructible counter. So Mondrak doubles the tokens Ratadrabik provides, while also giving us a sack outlet should we not have one on board. Not only this, but if we can sack Mondrak and then reanimate it, now we are making 4 tokens for every legend that dies. But we can make that situation even better. If we sack Mondrak right after we reanimate it, we will now get 2 additional Mondrak tokens, meaning the next legend that dies will give us 8 token copies. Mondrak can lead to some crazy board states with the right cards in hand, and can even win the game itself by making an incredibly large army. Drivnod, Carnage Dominus, is a 5-mana creature that says, if a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Also, we can pay 2 Phyrexian Black and exile 3 creatures from our graveyard to put an indestructible counter on him. So Drivnod is very similar to Mondrak in that it can result in some crazy board states, but the way Drivnod does so is a little different. To start with, When Drivnod first dies, he immediately gives us 2 token copies, unlike Mondrak which only gives us 1, meaning right away Drivnod can potentially let us create 3 token copies of the next legend that dies. For example, Grave Pact, Skullclamp, Junji, and Kakusha are just some cards that become incredibly powerful by getting additional triggers. Regardless, Drivnod is a card that, like Mondrak, very quickly turns our deck into overdrive and can generate value that approaches some of the most powerful value decks in the format. Owl the Dawnsky is a 5-mana creature with flying and vigilance and says, when Owl dies, choose 1. Look at the top 7 cards of your library, put any number of non-land permanent cards with total mana value 4 or less from among them onto the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, or put 2/1/1 counters on each permanent you control that's a creature or vehicle. So Owl's first ability, while not seemingly incredibly powerful, can actually win us the game with scary consistency. When we first sack Owl, we create a token copy, guaranteeing us the ability to do it again. So we ideally want to find a reanimation spell like Animate Dead, Dance of the Dead, Loyal Retainers, or Necromancy to return Owl to the battlefield, but even if we don't get it on the first hit, we can always try on the second. Regardless, after that we can aim for a variety of cards to help us continue the chain. Teysa Karlov will add an additional trigger each time an Owl dies, letting us really dig deep. Hidden Phyrexian or Ashnod's Altar gives us free mana, which might make a difference depending on what's in our hand. Even hitting a Mondrak on our first trigger means if we reanimate Owl on the second, now we can really start digging through our deck. Usually the chain ends with hitting Elasil Core and sacking enough creatures to kill the table, or simply making enough copies of a legend like Yosei that your opponents never get to untap again. The combo options are honestly quite vast, but all I will leave you with is that every time I've started chaining off with Owl, roughly 50% of the time I've won the game. The other times I haven't, it has left me in a very strong board position. If you play this deck against your opponents enough times, they will learn they can't let you resolve the Owl chain. Jia Howdan, the One-Eyed, is a 4-mana creature with horsemanship that we can sack to return a black card to our hand, though we do have to do this before our combat step. There are many black cards we want to recur in this deck, including our black recursion spells themselves, so being able to do so twice with this thanks to our commander just adds even more resilience and utility to the deck, ensuring we can continue on with our game plan. And that covers all of our utility cards. Now let's look at our lands and discuss the ones that contribute most to our game plan. Agadeem's Awakening is an MDFC that can come into play untapped, but we can also pay 3 mana and X to return any number of target creature cards that each have a different mana value X or less to the battlefield. This is a great late game mass reanimation spell that can quickly turn the tides in our favour and most importantly comes attached to a land, meaning we don't have to free up a non-land spot for it. This land is everything we could want for the deck and we are happy to include it. Another land that we feel the same about is Malakir Rebirth, an MDFC that comes into play tapped as a land, or for 1 mana we can choose target creature, lose 2 life, and until end of turn, that creature gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. This does exactly what we want it to, helping us to recur a key legendary back to the battlefield after we've sacked it, thus getting multiple copies of it on board. Even beyond this, we can also just use it as protection for Ratadrabik or a powerful non-legendary like Douthie Voidwalker in response to a board wipe. For 1 mana, this card does a lot in this deck. Iganjo, Seat of the Empire, is a land that taps for white mana, but it has an activated ability where we can pay 3 mana and discard it to deal 4 damage to an attacking or blocking creature. However, this ability costs 1 colourless less to cast for each legendary creature we control, meaning this can cost just 1 white with 2 legends on board. Being able to have a land act as a cheap removal piece is very useful to have, and makes drawing lands in the late game that much more useful. Takenuma, Abandoned Maya, is a land that taps for black mana, but it has an activated ability for 4 mana where we can discard it to mill 3 cards, then return a creature or planeswalker from our graveyard to our hand. Like Iganjo, it also costs 1 less to cast for each legendary creature we control, so with the right setup, this can cost only 1 mana to activate. This deck is all about making multiple copies of our legends, so having a land that gets them back from our graveyard to hand to cast again works perfectly with that plan. The mill is also a welcome bonus if we have other reanimation effects in hand, or simply have nothing useful in hand or graveyard and want to dig to an impactful creature. Tomb Fortress is a land that taps for black mana and enters the battlefield tapped. Now while we want to avoid tap lands as much as possible, exceptions to this are when they have a powerful enough effect. Well, Tomb Fortress also provides the ability to pay 5 mana, tap and exile it, to mill 4 cards and then return a creature from our graveyard to the battlefield. A reanimation effect on a land doesn't really get much better for this kind of deck, and even though the land does exile itself, the trade-off of also milling 4 cards to potentially make the reanimation effect even better is worth it. High Market and Phyrexian Tower are both lands that we can tap to sack a creature. Having sack outlets available early is key for this deck to reach its full potential, so being able to include them on lands is a welcome effect. Phyrexian Tower in particular is very good here, as it not only lets us sack creatures, but also gives us a good burst of mana as a reward too. Nykthos Shrine to Nyx is a land we can pay 2 mana into and add mana based on our devotion to a particular colour. Although this works best in a monocoloured deck, because we are so permanent heavy and have quite a few cards that are pip intensive, this should generate us a good amount of mana in the mid to late game. Shizo Death's Storehouse is a land we can pay a black into and tap to give a legendary creature fear until end of turn. Useful when life totals are getting low and we need to get that last bit of damage in. Because this taps for black mana and doesn't come into play tapped, the opportunity cost of running this is low. Our last land worth discussing is Volrath's Stronghold, which we can pay 2 mana and tap to put a creature card from our graveyard on top of our library. On top of all our other ways to recur creatures, this just adds another notch in the belt and ensures we have the consistency to always get back the creatures we need. And that's the deck. On the surface, Ratadrabik appears to be just another aristocrat strategy, yet because it blends in a reanimation sub-theme while also caring about legendaries and tokens, it separates itself from the pack and opens up fresh play patterns within that strategy. In addition, because of how these themes interact, it also opens up many unique lines and powerful synergies among many cards. Legendary creatures tend to have some of the most unique and interesting abilities of all card types, especially now Wizards is focusing on Commander, so Ratadrabik only has the ability to get more powerful and interesting over time. So if you've been looking to play a deck that not only has multiple ways of winning, but multiple ways of reaching that win, then this is the deck for you. As of recording, Ratadrabik is currently my favourite deck to play, because every time I bring it out to a table, it always presents something different for both myself and my opponents. Well, that's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed this look into Ratadrabik just as much as I enjoyed building it. But if you'd like to see the deck in action, make sure to stop by the channel where we have plenty of gameplay videos already so you can see what it's all about. Until next time, guys.